Welcome to Games to Reality, the channel where we talk about gaming, discuss some of our favorite video games, the context, how they play, what we think of them, and our opinions, and then relate them to reality, whether a historical viewpoint, current events, or even philosophical questions on the what if or does it even exist. I am Sanctorum, and with me is...
Malkariss.
And today's topic, we're going to be talking about Starfield to space travel, the newest space game that has been developed by
Bethesda.
Bethesda. Yes.
Let's talk about that.
So, previous Bethesda games, Skyrim, absolute 10 out of 10, still one of the best games probably out there with tons to do, tons to explore.
We also have to take a moment to discuss how many times Skyrim has been remade because it's that good of a game. They have something like, a dozen releases of it now?
At least a dozen releases, Game of the Year versions, and then if you want to even step foot into the modding community for that game, it's absolutely enormous.
100%. And then you have
So to give
Oblivion, right? The one that came before it was also really good.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, you got two 10 out of 10 games back to back, and then taking a step away from the medieval magical realm and into space travel is a different viewpoint for them. And going into Starfield, a single player space travel game, I've played a bit of it myself. I'm not sure the context of your experience in it.
Yeah, I've played for about maybe 10, 12 hours or so I wouldn't say that I've religiously played it, but I've gotten enough of the game under my belt to form some opinions about it. Especially when you start comparing it to like the Fallout franchise, which is maybe a little closer in genre than the Oblivion or Elder Scrolls franchise, right? But I don't know. I played for about 12 hours or so. How long have you played for?
I have about 7, 8 hours, and honestly, to be fair, space games really aren't my niche, so it's not really my forte to get hooked on them. I've tried several different space games, but Starfield, I didn't feel the hook or the grasp to it, and it seems there's kind of a split opinion base out there on the game from what I'm reading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that personally, I am on the side of saying this game probably should have been better. Now, don't get me wrong, it's got some good points to it. There's definitely a lot of things going for it. But to put it in perspective a little bit, I paid $100 for that game for early access. So I dropped 100 big ones on that game, and I got what I would consider to be a C, maybe B- game out of it. So the fact that I only put 10 hours into it and am now choosing to play other games instead of that game probably says a lot about what my overall opinions are on it.
Now, see, on the flip side, I got the game for free through my Xbox subscription, and even then, I didn't really feel hooked. At first, I will give credit to the character design, the backdrop. That's probably where I spent a couple hours of my time in the game alone, just developing my character, and that is absolutely incredible. All the features you have, everything you can do for character customization, 10 out of 10 on that.
Mm-hmm.
But moving into the game itself, I really didn't feel it grasp me into the hook, and it kind of just felt empty with the interactions in comparison to Fallout or Skyrim that you have. And I know the traditional players, I've seen the videos and I had to laugh because it says, what do you do in this kind of game? Well, you steal all of the office supplies that you can handle and bring them to your spaceship.
Yep. 100%. We all that's almost like a rite of passage in any Bethesda game, right? You have to steal everything in sight that's not nailed down. And you also have to quick save and just slaughter everyone. I mean, if you're not doing that, you're not playing a Bethesda game.
No, absolutely. I remember my first 6 playthroughs through Skyrim, and, well, I was a thief in the first village, and I got murdered every time by the guards because I got caught stealing, and then finally I realized, like, okay, maybe I should tone this back and play the game a bit. So in that true style, that's exactly what I did. First place I went, I was looting everything I could get my grubby little hands on, and then it made me laugh because I did see a video where someone had taken 20,000 potatoes and put them in the hull of the ship, and that was That's dedication right there.
I actually saw that video too, and I have to say the physics were pretty impressive, honestly. So they
They
do have
were. He
that.
opened the door and those potatoes pulled out and just fell, and then he closed the door. And I got to give him credit there for the mechanics of the game, but overall the game just kind of felt a little empty. And I will try to give it a second go later on. However, it just wasn't for me.
Hmm. I'm kind of the same opinion, honestly. I think I'm going to wait until there's the first major update and maybe give it another shot. But I don't know. There's just a few things that really bother me about it. Like, for instance, the NPCs, their faces. I know it's a modern game. The graphics are better than previous games, but even though the graphics are better, the faces look faker. If that makes sense. There's just no emotion behind it at all.
Yeah, it's kind of like they had a little bit too much plastic surgery just pulled back on their faces, and they can't really. And I mean, I get it. There's a lot of NPCs in the game. You go to the first spaceport, and there's people walking around everywhere. But still, your main characters or your roles where you're talking and discussing, I would agree with that as well.
Hmm.
The gameplay itself, I would say, is solid. I like the combat in the game. I like the features of the fighting. The different weapons they have in the game definitely seem fun. But overall, for myself, I just feel like it's not grabbing me in a true Bethesda manner.
Hmm. Yeah. I would 100% agree with that, without a doubt. It's especially coming from Bethesda. Personally, I go in with such a high expectation, right? It's a Bethesda game. Some of my favorite games of all time have been made by Bethesda. Speaking of the Skyrims, the Oblivions, the Morrowinds, Fallout, Fallout 4, Fallout 3, probably some of the best games I've ever played in my life. So to be fair, the bar was set extremely high, which in my opinion makes it a little easier for you to come in below the bar, right? Depending on what expectations you're going in with, too. So, in full transparency, I might be being harder on them because of that fact than I would if it was made by another developer. Do you feel any of that might be possible for you too, or?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you're looking at the fact of taking a game like Skyrim, Morrowind, where every single thing in the environment's interactive. You can talk to different people. The factions seem more in depth and alive. Even in the Fallout franchises, there's so much to do and explore, discover ways to play the game, side quests, and even though that's in here, it doesn't seem as fulfilling. So yeah, I would agree. If it was a different company, different developer, I'd probably be a little more easy on them. But maybe that first major update will add some more content, some more heart and feel behind it. But it kind of came off more like the Destiny series to me, where it's like, hey, go out and do your stuff, rinse and repeat.
Yeah.
Depending how you want to start out, might change it.
Did,
Overall, wasn't truly satisfied.
yeah. Did you see the video? I don't recall the lady's name, unfortunately, but she had the question that was bothering all of us. Are the planets in the distance actually there and can you reach them? And she set her ship on stream and flew 7 hours to Pluto. And when she got there, she actually did get there, by the way. Pluto was reachable. But it was just a sprite that she flew directly through. After 7 hours.
And that's kind of one of those. If the game's that big, why aren't the planets there? One of the things I did see and I read about was the fact that you go to a planet, and besides the reason you're on the planet, there's not much else there to explore, to do, to find. It's just a kind of empty planet with maybe some mining nodes or a few enemies here and there, but it's not really worth exploring an entire planet over if you're past the quest line on it.
Yeah, there wasn't much extra content to do on that planet other than whatever quest line you were doing. 100%.
Yeah, so hopefully the drive in the future will bring more to it. And as I stated before, I have a jaded opinion. Space games really aren't my type of niche to begin with. So to go ahead and get into those and expect a big outcome to hook, it would have been a long shot to begin with. The gameplay is smooth, and I like the mechanics behind the gameplay. But overall, I mean, space travel just really isn't my personal genre anyway. I was hoping that would change with their previous titles, thinking maybe this one stood a chance, but it did not pull me in.
Mm-hmm. And that's fair. It's not for everyone. Absolutely. Although, in all fairness, I do have to say, I do have some good memories from Starfield, from the 10, 12 hours that I've played so far. I've definitely enjoyed some of the Juggernaut missions where you go in and you just absolutely slaughter a huge army of mercenaries, right? With your laser rifles and everything. That was a lot of fun. However, in those battles, one thing that I noticed is my PC was lagging. And for context, I have probably one of the best gaming computers that you can buy today with an RTX 4090 and one of the newest i9 cores Intel processors, and my computer was lagging during those fights. My computer should never lag.
No, you should be able to run that on ultra settings with no problem whatsoever and have no issues with any game that's on the market today. So
yeah, it almost
that's
felt
kind of one of those.
Yeah, it almost felt like I was getting punished for not playing it on Xbox, to be honest. Almost like they didn't actually finish optimizing it for PC before it was released.
I mean, that's fair, but I mean, I played it on my Xbox app through my PC, and I'm running a 3070 Ti, and I didn't have my graphics all the way up, so I really didn't feel the stress on that for that part or that particular portion. I haven't actually downloaded it or tried it on console, but it does seem from reviews to run a lot smoother.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And one of my other favorite parts too, I'm sure that you probably played with this a little bit, but the fact that you have control over the power systems in your ship, that you can actually manually take power from this system and power this system up more, so you can boost your shields but take weapons from your warp drive, or not weapons, take power from your warp drive. I love that dynamicness that adds into the game and the control that it gives you during battle. That's probably my favorite feature of the game, to be honest, so far.
That I would have to second that. That is such an awesome feature. When you're watching movies and anything space related from Star Wars to Guardians of the Galaxy, you always hear that kind of talk to that Star Trek, whether it's full power to the engines or full power to front shields, divert the power from here to there, that is an awesome concept, absolutely. And that's probably one of my favorites too.
Mm-hmm. Makes you feel like you're kind of living it a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. If it was more in depth to the point of the travel that's there, and at some point in the game it may be, because I know you can hire crews, you can get people on board to help you, and as you progress through the story, which is why I do want to get another go, I just don't feel it's hooking me, and I kind of got to force myself to play, and that's not what I'm looking for in a game. I'm looking for a game that grabs me, and next thing you know, 6 hours goes by, and I have no idea what happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems to be almost a trend lately with games. I've noticed a lot. When they're released, it's almost like they're not fully developed anymore. A lot of times, it seems like they're rushed out the door, and even if they're free add-ons or free patches later, but features are added later, more content is added later, sometimes you have to pay for it, sometimes you don't. But it seems to be a trend that developers are taking a lot more these days than they used to.
Absolutely, and I think a part of that is the evolution of gaming. I mean, you go back to the Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Sega, 64, you released a game, that was a final product. You couldn't go back later and patch in something or fix something or have DLC or a new expansion pack. If it was a new expansion, it was a part 2 to a game with either a new CD or a whole new cartridge. There was no, we're going to fix something later. This is the product and this is what you get. Where nowadays it's, we can go ahead and push something out and hot fix it later, put a patch out later, add an expansion, DLC, microtransactions, whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm. A lot more easier to do that now, for sure. And a lot of developers, I've been listening to some YouTube content, right? So I've actually heard some developers. Now, this isn't specific towards Bethesda, to be clear, but in some of the other companies that are developing other major games right now, a lot of the developers don't actually play the game that they're working on, which I find quite interesting. Back in the day when you used to have, like you were saying, the CD releases and everything, the developers were the beginning of that community. And the players built off of that. They expanded on it, and the developers were right up front just loving that game. And we're seeing a lot less of that, and I honestly think it shows in the final products.
Absolutely. You're going from a product that's built with heart and compassion for their own little world to be pushed out to everyone else to enjoy, to a dev team who's developing something to push out to make money compared to doing it for the love of gaming. And there are small indie companies out there that do it, and you see it all the time, but they don't have the same force that Activision, Bethesda, Blizzard, all of those major companies have behind it have thousands of employees behind a game for developing. And then the testers are the ones who are really playing the game for it to get pushed out and releasing bug notes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I love the fact, kind of circling back to Starfield a little bit specifically here, and that lady whose name I can't remember, but I'm sure we'll probably try to include in the description. When she flew the 7 hours to Pluto, I don't know the exact distance from Earth to Pluto, but it's a very, very big distance. So the game must have obviously shrunk that distance down, right? But if you think of it in kind of like a real term, covering that vast distance from Earth to Pluto in 7 hours and how fast that would be, that's got to be faster than light, I would imagine. So I kind of wonder what kind of mechanics and what kind of mathematics and everything, or if I'm just overthinking it, go into the development and into the back end in order to calculate those distances and determine the movements of the planets and all that stuff. That's something that blows my mind too.
Right, and I'm definitely not a math guy. Otherwise, I'd probably be making a little bit more money than I am. But geometry is about the top peak of my math skills right there. So to start getting into space calculation and speed and light years and distances, and that's way above my education. But it's a good point to go into the whole topic of space travel, the second part of this, and talking about the reality of this game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. How realistic do you think the space travel is in Starfield? So you're not in space a whole lot, it doesn't feel like. And there's loading screens, which definitely aren't real, right? But other than that, I don't know. So one thing that I've noticed that's very distinct is the sound, right? As you're shooting your lasers and your missiles, which gets complicated a little bit too. But you can hear them. You can hear the lasers, you can hear the explosions of the ships in the distance. And that's always something that's always intrigued me because space is a vacuum, right? So you don't hear sounds. There's nothing for sound to permeate through. So you wouldn't actually hear the ships blowing up as you're shooting them out of the air. It would just be totally silent to you in the cockpit, which is quite interesting.
Right, but how would you channel that into a video game? I guess you'd be kind of disappointed as a gamer in a big open space fight, and you see all these explosions possibly to a point, but really you wouldn't hear anything as far as that going on. But that would be kind of losing the interest of the gamer themselves when they blow a ship up and nothing happens.
Yeah, it's kind of like where they have to make that choice between, do we want to be realistic a little bit, or do we want to make the decision towards entertainment and keeping the players happy? And I think that's one of those areas where they made that choice of, I'm sure that they knew that it would make a sound, but to your point, well, that's going to be some boring gameplay if you can't hear anything.
Right, and that's why I kind of laugh, because you take like Guardians of the Galaxy and they take moments like that and he's just got his headset in because there might not be something in here, so hey, let's put some good music on and rock and roll instead. And even then, a lot of the times he's on a planet or it's not in that situation, but either they make the sounds of weaponry and ships blowing up, they go with silence, or they pay a bunch of people to develop music, and every time you get in a fight, there's just loud music playing, which could also get really annoying and take away from the gameplay or the fight itself. So I think they did all right with it. But you take the reality of being in a vacuum in space, yeah, sound's not going to travel, so you're not going to see that or hear those reactions.
What about the future of humanity's space travel? So in Starfield, you have many, many planets that have been colonized, that have been seemingly terraformed because you're walking on the surface, you're breathing without a helmet on a lot of them. And they're sort of like a galactic civilization, right? Do you think that we'll ever get there one day as a species? Or do you think that's more of a science fiction?
I think it's possible. I mean, obviously, the number one person right now who's leading that charge is Elon Musk, and he's very set on colonizing Mars by 2050. So I know they sent a unmanned cargo rocket, and they plan on sending a second sometime next year in 2024 to Mars for a test, looking at how they can set that up. And by 2050, he wants people on Mars colonizing it.
Mm-hmm. That's just absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, you think of our last great space accomplishment, right? We had the James Webb Space Telescope is probably our most recent one. If you don't count, India just landed on the moon recently, right? That was pretty great. But to go from those steps, from the moon to launching telescopes, those are all very impressive things and technically just super complicated to execute, right? Everything in space wants us to fail. Nothing about it is friendly. But then you take that jump to Mars, and it almost feels like that jump it's not the next level. You're not going from level 1 to level 2 in difficulty. It's magnitudes more difficult than going to the moon because it's so far away. It blows my mind that that's actually where we're at, where we're on the peak of potentially doing this in the future. This could happen in our lifetimes.
Yeah, and it's absolutely mind-blowing to think of the fact that if they are going to colonize the moon, you're talking about 6 to 9 month cycles before anything could even show up, pending when they get that down and resupplies, or if something goes wrong. So colonize out there. I think one of the best things that kind of depicted that was The Martian. I don't know if you've seen that movie, but the things he had to do out there and everything went wrong. You're trying to actually put that into a real world aspect now. By 2050, actually have a colony out there trying to survive and start terraforming a planet.
Mm-hmm. And to your point, any efforts that we make on Mars need to be self-sufficient because it's so far away, right? When they were on the moon, it took less than half of a minute in delay for communication in each direction. So they would send a message from the moon, within 30 seconds or so, I think it was less than 30 seconds, we would get that message and be able to respond. So there's a minute delay, round trip. On Mars, that delay is closer to a 20-minute delay, which is useless in an emergency. You can't phone home and wait for instruction on a 20-minute delay. That's absolutely useless. So they need to be able to make those decisions, make those calls, and kind of run the mission themselves independently from us, which adds a whole new layer of complexity.
Right, because now you're not just talking general astronauts who are going up to space to be in the space station and do research. You're talking about engineers, doctors, farmers, agriculturalists. You're talking about a plethora of different people you're going to need just to colonize Mars. And we're talking about Mars. When you're looking at Starfield, you're talking about light travel and going to planets that are far, far beyond what the reach of Mars is, and we haven't even hit that step yet. So, I mean, I don't think we'll ever see it in our lifetime, let alone space travel on that level, or especially, warp speed, as they would call it. But I do think we could see colonization on Mars in our lifetime.
Yeah, that'll be really interesting. That's one of the things about Starfield is when you go to a different planet, you go to the menu, you click the planet, and boom, you're there. If real life space travel, if we could get it that easy, that would change things around. But of course, as far as we know at the moment, that's probably science fiction. Maybe we could get a loading screen to pop up.
Right. I mean, you're talking about there's always been the research with, black hole theory and how it's a bend in time and you pop in at one point, pop out the other, but there's no way to definitely prove that to this point. So it's kind of along the lines of who's going to be the first one to A, get close enough to a black hole, B, say, all right, well, let's see what's on the other end and go in the name of science and space exploration, but we're not even calculated to the point of we could reach a black hole yet.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the really interesting things that I've read about is when you talk about those thrusters that actually use a bend in space-time, right? Because there's a few of them that have been designed. I want to say one's called a Skardev thruster, something like that. I'm slaughtering that name. But they kind of take that concept of, well, if you can't travel faster than light in space, what if we bend space? And then we can actually travel faster that way by kind of using space to propel us, so we're not breaking any laws of physics. And it's something that they have actually, there's been research papers on this, peer-reviewed research papers, and, well, I think pretty much the consensus is that, this is bordering on the verge of science fiction. The math checks out, right? So mathematically, it's possible. But one of the biggest things that they have determined to be a reason why it will probably never happen is it requires negative energy. And that's something that we have not discovered yet. Hypothetically, negative energy should be possible. There's these objects called white holes, which we've never observed, so they probably don't actually exist, but theoretically they could, which is literally the opposite of a black hole, where it's almost an inverse black hole, where it's spewing out material instead of sucking it in. And that's quite interesting to think about. But sometimes there's really distinct differences between mathematical theory and what we actually observe in the universe. And I think that's one of those differences of, it might work on paper, but will we ever get there? But God knows what technology is going to look like 10 generations down the line,
No, absolutely. I mean, if you go back to the Cold War with the space race and the race to the moon in 1969, Neil Armstrong, I mean, look at the computers they had then and everything for processing power, not to mention calculating it by hand. All of that they had in 1969 and more is available to you today in Microsoft Excel.
Yeah, that's a really
that program
good point.
is more powerful than everything they had then. So, and you're not even talking about 100 years of advancement. So you're looking at 70, almost 70 years ago. We've advanced this far now to the point where there's more satellites than they probably would have thought was possible. Independent countries launching their own satellites, phone companies, SpaceX, NASA, governments from all over the world have satellites in space. That's almost just a routine occurrence now. And the International Space Station has been going on, and knock on wood, has had no issues with replenishments, new crews coming and going, how much time spent in space. So theoretically, I think it would be possible, but you're looking at, as you said before, you're not going from level 1 to level 2. You're taking it into a whole new game at that point. Mars itself, now if you're talking about anything beyond the reach of Mars to another planet, Earth-like planet that's light years away, I don't foresee that being in our time in any case. With science, nothing. I mean, I think we're still, if at all, we're eons away from that kind of technology.
Yeah. And so the trip to Mars, I don't remember exactly the time frame, but I'm pretty confident it was over a year to get there, right? It was something like a year and 3 months or a year and a half, something in that time frame. Does that sound right?
I want to say when I was listening to a video from Elon Musk talking about it, his concept and the goal on how they would go to and from Mars would take between 6 to 9 months.
Oh, is
And I
that
want to say it
short?
was actually about 7 months, roughly. And the way they were calculating it is the gravity on Mars is less than Earth, so you would need less fuel to take off from Mars as you would from Earth. So they could make one trip from Earth to Mars, which is why he's been very proactive in reusable rockets and having them have the ability to land instead of crashing, so that way they could go to a designated area, land, and then be able to be relaunched.
Mm-hmm. It does help make things a lot easier when you don't have to build a whole new rocket each time.
Right, and it's not like they're going to have fuel on Mars to refuel either, so or another rocket to rebuild and come back to Earth. It's going to have to come back unless you're sending rocket after rocket to Mars, and then on that case, if something does have to come back, how do you get it back?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, reusable rockets are the way to go. Have you ever watched the videos of those landing themselves? That's the coolest thing in the world.
Yeah, I laughed because in one of those videos where he was talking about that, he said the reason he made the tip of the rocket more pointy was from the movie. Was it oh, what movie was it? They were talking about it, and he said he wanted the tip of the rocket to be more pointy, which is why Elon Musk designed it that way because he thought it was funny. He's like, there is no scientific or practical reason. He said, if anything, it actually hurts the rocket itself.
He did it for the memes, basically.
Pretty much, which he's notorious for doing. But I mean, by 2050, colonization on the moon, I would say it's highly likely that could happen. And honestly, maybe in our lifetime, we're going to read about the first baby born on the moon, who, in our experience, for as far as we know, is the first human that'll be born off of Earth on another planet, which is just mind blowing to think about itself.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's going to be a name that's going to be remembered forever. Is that first baby born? That's going to be in every history book.
Absolutely. That's going to be another, as far as Neil Armstrong and in our generation, the Elon Musk or those names, it's going to be one ringing through saying this was the first baby born on Mars.
It'll be really interesting to see what the long-term effects of microgravity will be on people. I know that we have some experience in that from the space station, right? We have people up there for, decent amounts of time consecutively, and people that return there more than once too. And it's just really interesting to me to read and hear about some of those things. Like one of the things that has been reported, which has no explanation, is eyesight degradation, which is minor and usually goes away once they return to Earth. But why does it happen? No one really knows. There's a couple theories there, but no one knows. Or how your body's programmed to pump blood up into your head because gravity's continually pushing all your blood down into your feet. And so our bodies have naturally adapted to that, to rush more blood up to our heads. And our bodies do adapt to that situation, but it takes a little bit of time. And I just wonder, like, what other random stuff like that we're going to discover the more and more we have people out in space for longer terms at a time, like a colony on the moon, for instance.
Taking it back to relation to Starfield, too, you send someone to space right now, we don't have a way to artificialize gravity.
Mm-hmm.
So you are free floating. How do you take and make artificial gravity so when you're on these ships, you get up and you're walking around going through space? Now you're talking about sending people to Mars. Are they just going to be free floating for 7 months and then they arrive at Mars, or is there a way to take and artificialize gravity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting, because what does free floating for that long in a confined space, what does that do to you? Not only from a physical perspective, but also from a mental health perspective. Knowing that you're on a rocket in the middle of nowhere, quite literally, hurling through space, and the slightest mistake could kill you and your crewmates. That's got to take a mental toll on anybody.
Right. And I know in 2022, like Elon Musk revealed the artificial gravity starship saying, hey, yeah, we're going to be able to do this. We can walk on surfaces outside of Earth as if we are. It can match it. But the concept has been around since obviously before the 90s, but as far as being developed, they were developed in the 90s, and looking at that concept of taking artificial gravity, applying it to real world space travel. One, it's just another system that can go wrong. Could you live without it? Potentially, but if you're talking about light years of being in zero gravity, I think that would have long term effects on the human body. And I'm not a doctor, but I mean, you're not using any of your muscles really at that point. You're not. So, I mean, I feel like there would be some long term effects that could come of that. And by any means, I'm not qualified to talk about that, nor am I smart enough to talk about that. I would just say the common sense theory behind it would be if you spend a year in space, you come back to Earth, and all of a sudden you're under full gravity again. It's got to take some getting used to.
Oh yeah, it's got to put stress on your bones, I would imagine, too. Because eventually you would think, and once again, to agree with you, I'm not really qualified to talk on this topic either, right? But just thinking out loud here, you would think that your skeleton would make adjustments and it would stretch out a little bit as gravity's lessened. And so to come back to Earth after being gone for how long and your body not being used to that pressure, that's got to do something, right? It has to.
Right. It's not like being weightless for 6 months and all of a sudden you come back and you're ripped as can be still because there's no way to use your muscles really. You're weightless.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like you can grab something heavy in space and bench press. You can, but you're not getting much out of it.
That's my kind of workout.
Right?
0G workout. I'd sign up for that. Well, now
technically, is that a world record if you bench press it in space? This person bench pressed the new bench press record's 2,500 pounds because that's what they could fit on the rocket. They're one fingering holding onto it in space.
We might have to reach out to the guys at Guinness and Elon Musk, see if he wants a publicity stunt.
Yeah, there you go, right? Send up the new world's strongest guy to break every record possible for weightlifting.
We'll have me do it. I'll wear my glasses just to rub it in. My nerd glasses.
I was going to say, yeah, until you get back to Earth and all those strong guys' records you just broke and took their fame are waiting to punch you in the face.
Well, yeah, maybe I won't do it. Going back to the artificial gravity a little bit, I actually hadn't heard that they were working on that as a feasible option. I had heard of different ways that could potentially be done, and I was just curious, is the way that they're planning on doing that like the centrifugal rotating method, where it's basically a rotating drum and you're on it being kept pushed against it by the centrifugal force? Is that kind of what they're thinking, or was there something else, or do you know more about that at all?
So that seems to be the initial way they were doing it, is rotating through, and I know it had to deal with, once again, we get into math, but you're talking about being so far away in like a tether formation, as they called it, from what I was reading and looking at it, and I could be way off on this, but basically, yeah, they would do a giant cylinder which consists of rotating in opposite directions to create an artificial gravity. Kind of like you ever go to the fair as a kid and get on the Gravitron, that ride that spins really fast?
Those were my favorite until I was about 12, and I passed out on it, and now I don't like them anymore.
Well, that's sort of the concept in a very Neanderthalish way, is to spin you really fast around and stick you to the wall. So the concept would be to recreate that very basic concept, except on a much more complex level in space, to where you're walking steady, but it feels like you're on Earth. And I mean, the math behind that, as I said, I'm not a mathematician, but the math behind knowing what the RPMs have to be, how much force to generate so you're not generating too much or too little force, and being able to maintain that alone, I imagine, would be some obstacles in order to create that artificial gravity. Not to mention the weight, the systems, and everything else you have to send up with that starship or rocket, however you want to classify the size of that, would be.
Yeah, it's crazy to me. Space travel is just, in general, it's so difficult just by its very nature. I mean, everything is working against us. Even if we were able to figure out the microgravity and the mental health tolls that it's taking on people and everything we've talked about, I mean, there's still just a plethora of things just looking to wreck our day, right? Like, what about the radiation? It's horrible, and the further and further out you go, and the faster you move, the worse problem of irradiation becomes. So it's mind blowing to me that we can do what we can do today. I think that a lot of people underestimate everything that's went into it, and it's just such an accomplishment. And I think that that's something that humanity should really pat themselves on the back for.
No, absolutely. I mean, you talk about the radiation alone. I mean, you're talking about totally different levels, gamma radiation, and different types of radiation in space. I mean, it's bad enough when you go to get an x-ray for a broken bone and they cover everything else in lead and the doctors are behind a protective barrier. Now you're talking about full exposure for months on time to different types of radiation. I mean, I don't think it's going to transform anyone into the Hulk or anything.
Darn it.
But long-term exposure like that, when you're talking on like a Starfield type level, going through light year or light speed travel, I should say, and hyper jumping or engaging the hyperdrive and then jumping light years at a time, I imagine there's unforeseen effects on that. And I would also imagine it depends what kind of star system or galaxy you're in and what's around being produced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's so much that we don't know, right?
Absolutely. Like, do you send them up there with just radiation monitors and away they go? And I mean, that's even the same thing of we go to test the first hyperdrive, or if one is ever invented, is that a manned ship? You sending monkeys up there to test, and I know in the past they've had animals in space to test. So what's going to be the concept there? Because if it does work and they jump, what happens then when they can't get back?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, at least we have a history of animal testing with space travel. What was it? The Soviets, they sent up, I forgot the dog's name, but they sent up a dog and orbited him around the moon, right? Before the manned space travel, which of course the US did that, but the Soviets back in the day actually sent a dog around the moon first. And I know they did some experimentation with like turtles and stuff too. So, it might be a little bit cruel, but you know what? It's better than a human at the very least to get an idea on some of that, right?
Right. And it was two dogs.
The
Soviets sent to space. 1950s. I think it was early 50s. But the first two that went, I don't think it actually ever reached orbit. So I can't remember. I know that I think the dog you're talking about was a different one, but I don't remember their names. But yeah, it was the early 50s, and I don't think they ever reached orbit. I don't know about the dog that actually did reach orbit. Oh, it was on Sputnik, one of the Sputniks.
Ah, Sputnik ones.
We have that history, but at the same time, now you're talking about a controlled orbit.
Mm-hmm.
Where we still have control of the systems, bring it home, compared to a hyperdrive test where you're looking at the theoretical travel of jumping to another star system or light years, or who knows, you're talking about trying to jump from here to Saturn in a matter of hours compared to years.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing to think about too that we have that they didn't have back then. So one, the problems that we're trying to overcome are bigger. But two, we have more tools at our disposal. So we do have animals, but we also have a new emerging technology that's really getting serious, and that is, of course, artificial intelligence. And honestly, I think, in my opinion, that's going to make or break where we go with space travel, especially with these longer, potentially super fast, super long drives. Is that might not be a person at all at the end of the day. That might be completely artificial.
And taking a look just on, like, with Tesla, the artificial intelligence that's in a Tesla with a self-driving vehicle is just astonishing as it is. So if you apply that to space travel with the same type of concept, yeah, it's completely feasible, I would think. But I mean, at the same time, I don't know if I trust the level of chat GT and college kids to say, hey, write me a paper on space travel and how do we jump from here, and then say, okay, let's follow these instructions. AI said it's good. But Tesla's done a lot of work with that, and safety features alone, sensors, things like that. I think AI. I think it won't be long before it's more AI piloting and self-driving, and really we're just there as a fail-safe in case something goes wrong with the vehicle to take over in all reality.
Mm-hmm. It's a technology that I feel has a long way to go, but I feel has already come a long way too. And I also feel that at some point when we talk about domestic driving with vehicles, at some point it becomes a moral obligation for us to employ that, right? Because if it's a safer technology and it is overall reducing crashes and death rates, it's almost immoral not to have that as a wide deployment, not to have that everywhere. If we're saving lives and we know that it's a vast measurable difference.
Right. And I mean, you even take that from Starfield. You start off with the first droid he gives you to help you and escort you. And that droid is not just a safety protocol, but it's a navigator. It knows where to go, it can contact. And that even goes into Star Wars with droids and the level of AI that droids have, depending on their programming. We're in reality not that far away from looking at like Siri or what is it called on Windows? There's
Cortana.
yeah, Cortana, which is to me is more of a Halo thing, you know,
Mm-hmm.
Cortana and that down that memory lane. But you have these AI centers that are out there. Is that going to be more what you're looking for? Is the AI going to be built right into a starship or a space shuttle? Or is it going to be piloted by robotic droids that handle everything? And that brings up the whole law of robotics and how they're programmed, and what if something goes wrong with them, or what if you are in space and get hit with a solar flare and it fries electronics, or like those kind of things on long distance travel. It's just a lot to think about the what ifs with it, where you compare it to the game Starfield. You hop off the planet, hop in your ship, you hit the button, you take off, you're in space, you, like you said, go to a start menu, press a button, and you're there. Now, I get it. I don't think it would be a very fun video game if you go into Lightspeed and it says come back in 23 hours, 2 minutes, and 58 seconds, your travel will be completed.
Mm-hmm.
However, to what extent of that could actually translate to something we might be seeing in a few hundred years, maybe sooner, maybe not at all, ever.
Yeah. And with cryostasis, I think is what they're calling it, where basically they put you under for a long duration and put you in some sort of suspension. That's not something that I believe we can do today, but I know it's something that has been science fiction for a long time too. Maybe in the future, it's as simple as, hey, we have a 400-year flight. Get in your pod and we'll wake you up. God knows where the future's going to be.
Yeah, right. I mean, you look at that's been in so much science fiction. I mean, from Futurama, for him being fries frozen for 1,000 years with no issues and wakes up in the year 3000, to the concept of Han Solo in Star Wars being frozen in carbonite and delivered to Jabba the Hutt. You know, the concept's always been there, but so has the concept of warp speed or intergalactic star travel. All of those concepts are always there, but bringing them to reality, from science fiction to reality, that's a whole different ball game that I believe is left to people a lot smarter than the two of us sitting here having a conversation about it.
Amen to that. I'm quite curious on your thoughts. If we had to rate Starfield as a game, but then also rate it more towards accuracy as to what's possible to do today with today's technology, I personally think I'd rate Starfield as a video game as like maybe 6 out of 10 or so. Kind of curious what your thoughts are on that.
As a video game, I'd probably give it a 7, 7.5, because I mean, I'm looking at the overall visualization is pretty, the mechanics are outstanding, and the gameplay is, from what I've experienced, smooth.
So I think the extra point for me comes from the fact that I spent $100 on it, and you got it for free.
That's, you know what, that's fair. That's probably fair concept to give that extra point there was it cost me zero money, so I'm being nice here.
Yeah, I think we're seeing levelly on that eye to eye. Otherwise, so what about for reality? So obviously, it's quite futuristic. There's a lot of things that might be possible in the future, but aren't possible today. You know, like I'm assuming they've done terraforming because, kind of like we talked about, there's people walking around other planets without helmets on. There's artificial intelligence robots. I forgot the name of the one at the beginning of the game you mentioned. There's beam weapons, things of that nature. So I think that it's quite science fiction-y. But I think that out of everything I've seen in the game today, I think that it's believable as being technology that's probably within humanity's grasp, with maybe the only exception being the laser weapons. That's something that I've always had a problem with is laser guns. But other than that, I think everything is kind of attainable.
I'd have to agree with you on that, with the exception of the laser weapons. I think those are just obtainable as well, and if you look at different militaries and stuff experimenting with them, there are laser weapons that are used and utilized, maybe not in the concept of a blaster or a plasma rifle, but that technology is advancing when you're looking at different classes of lasers and looking at the strength that a laser can provide. I wouldn't underestimate that weaponry too far off in the future as well. Maybe, like I said, not on the level of a blaster pistol or a rifle, but I'm not going to necessarily say it's not going to happen either.
Mm-hmm. That's a fair point because I think one of the things that I might fail to take into consideration in that opinion is that our storage of energy today, when it comes to batteries and things of that nature, is extremely inefficient, right? That's just an area that we suck at. And I know that there's several things in the hopper that might be major breakthroughs for that in the future. But if we could get that energy storage to be more condensed and more efficient, then maybe it takes the feasibility of a handheld laser rifle and makes that much more probable, right? So I think you might be onto something.
Well, I mean, the U.S. Navy itself has been testing it for years, and I mean, they've been doing direct energy weapons testing and layered laser defense testing and different weapon systems, which they plan on deploying out onto ships or they're used for defensive measures. I mean, it's there.
Wow.
It's not really highly talked about, but if you look into it, it is there and it is being employed. But that's on a massive scale level still. We're not talking about condensing enough stuff down that'll fit into the size of a pistol or a M4 platform and having endless energy essentially being fired out of it, because the amount, I would imagine, for the harm that it's caused, like in Star Wars, to kill someone with a laser beam and fire over and over again with the amount of energy they have seems a little crazy, but I don't think it's impossible.
Mm-hmm. That's a fair point. Especially, yeah, with the infinite energy thing that you're mentioning, that's very true, especially when you look at the stormtroopers from Star Wars, right? They never hit the target, so they can't just have limited batteries. It's got to be infinite.
Hey, allegedly, they never hit the target because the Jedi are using the Force to redirect. Allegedly, I don't know about that. I think they just need to work on their basic training some more, marksmanship skills.
Yeah, that's their claim.
But yeah, I mean, overall, I think it's definitely plausible. The terraforming is its own. That's going to be something. Like I said, I don't understand the science behind it all the way, but to create an atmosphere almost, that seems going to be either a lot of work, getting organisms to live and adapt, and eventually terraforming to the point where an atmosphere is created and there's breathable oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
I would have to definitely read more into that or talk to someone smarter than me, but that seems one of the more upfront challenges at hand. I mean, we can bring domes, we can bring buildings to Mars, we can get that oxygen, have plants inside, but to actually terraform the planet to where you can walk outside of your house to your car and breathe the air on Mars, now you're talking. I think we're still a ways away. So I mean, taking that into concept with Starfield, I mean, we're talking a technology that's far beyond what we have, but I don't think impossible.
Yeah. And I actually recently on my YouTube channel reacted to the idea of terraforming other planets. So I happen to have some of this recently in my brain. And the idea of terraforming a planet is quite possible from a scientific standpoint, but the scale of it, you're talking an entire planet, right? And the energy needed to pull it off and the materials needed to build everything that you need to pull it off. It's something that might be scientifically possible, but at least within our current technological bounds, we would never see that just because of the sheer scale and effort required. It would be a multi-generational project for many generations. And I think kind of driving back to the artificial intelligence part, which is of course the new buzzword today that everybody's talking about, and rightfully so. Once we get to a point where we can have machines doing this for us at a much higher pace and able to actually replicate more of them, which is scary territory, but once we get there, I think a lot of things that are bordering on the edge of science fiction will become reality just because simply we can tackle larger scales too.
Right. I mean, you take that concept and now you send a shipment of robots to a far off planet with instructions, this, that, and tell them terraform the planet. And they report back every so often or whatever the case may be. I mean, now you're looking at a whole different concept, but even then you're talking probably generations of work. It's just not generations of humans trying to get it done. It's robotics. But even then, that brings its own complications into the mix of lifespan on a machine, batteries, power on machines. You do solar, what happens when the panels go down? So I mean, there's still a lot to work out there just from a engineering standpoint and a logistical standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, as far as taking it and taking the concept of where we're at today to when we could be someplace like Starfield, I don't think it's something you and I nor our children will see anytime soon.
I would 100% agree with that.
It would be cool. I just don't think it's there yet, and it's going to be a while to get to that level.
Mm-hmm. 100%.
Well, this has been Games to Reality, Starfield to Space Travel. Let us know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and looking forward to hearing more from you in future episodes. Stay tuned for some of our future episodes upcoming. Next week is going to be Sea of Thieves to Shanghai's, where we're going to take the game Sea of Thieves and then relate it to actual historical events of piracy, and maybe even delve into the modern world of piracy. Yes, they do exist, and pirates are still out there today.
R.